Daylight saving time strikes again. This Sunday at 2 a.m., we'll be springing ahead and losing that hour of sleep. We'll pull ourselves out of bed in the dark on Sunday morning with the promise of that late day sunshine to come. We'll convince our kids it's time to go to bed Sunday night, even when it's still light out. We'll slowly get used to the time adjustment, and then we'll switch back in November, putting our circadian clocks through the same confusion. Or will we?
People may still be adjusting to the time change, but thanks to Congress, switching your clocks may soon be a thing of the past.
In recent years, there's been a push by politicians to go to daylight saving time year-round. But not everyone is a fan of this proposed change.
It messes up my sleep patterns. I end up waking up way early, and it seems like it takes me months to come out of that.
This week, we are going off the radar to get some perspective on all this clock-changing business. We'll check in with a sleep expert to find out what the best solution is for our health. And we'll get an update on the current state of the Sunshine Protection Act from meteorologist Andrew Buck Michael. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie, and you're listening to Off the Radar, a production of the National Weather Desk. On the show, we dig deep into topics about weather, climate, the ocean, space, and much more. Our goal is to help you better understand the weather and to love it as much as we do. Andrew Buck Michael, fellow Sinclair broadcast meteorologist and podcaster. You have a podcast too, right?
I do, called Weathering the Run, where I talk to other runners about the craziest weather that they've run through.
I have talked to you about that. It's fun. It's nice to learn about that and not have to do any of the running myself. But y'all are nuts. I can't believe what you run through sometimes. Cool. Well, plug for your podcast there. And thanks for coming on Off the Radar to talk about this subject that I'd say you're more knowledgeable about. You started making videos about this, kind of giving people updates on where we were with this whole time change debacle. And we're coming up now on spring ahead. And we are going to change the clocks, which there was some talk for some time that we weren't going to, right? So can you give me like a little background on the Sunshine Protection Act and where it stands right now?
So this was originally introduced by Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, and he introduced this back in March of 2001. Now, there's a whole new version, the Sunshine Protection Act of 2023. But initially, when he introduced this back in 2021, it actually passed the Senate unanimously. However, and a lot of people, this is what's been really confusing, is that viewers hear, hey, it passed, we're done with daylight saving. But a lot of people forget how a bill becomes a law. So it goes from the Senate, and then it goes back to the House, and they needed to vote on it there. However, the Russian-Ukrainian war started, and this basically didn't move forward at all. And it just basically sat at the House. It never went forward. If it did pass there, then it would go to the president, and he would have to sign that. Or if he vetoed it, then it would go back to basically the override vote. So it didn't go anywhere. So what happened is that just last year, Senator Marco Rubio again introduced it into the Senate, and then he also had Republican Buchanan, also from Florida, introduced it in the House. So far, it's sat in both of those locations. What is interesting is that there were also some other people that co-signed this. They've always co-signed it in March, and I think that if this does pass, it has a better chance in March when we're springing forward, when we're losing that extra hour of sleep. People seem to be a little crankier, want to end it for good, than in the fall when we fall backwards, when everyone gets that extra hour of sleep. So we'll see. There's two different bills. There's the Senate version, which is the Senate Bill 582, and then the House bill, which is 1279. So there's two different bills right now, and so far they have not been voted on.
Okay, so a little refresher there on like fifth grade civics class, which was good. But then also the Sunshine Protection Act, and it's funny, all these people from Florida, the Sunshine State, want this, states that we would go to daylight saving year-round, which is the time that we're on in the summer where it stays light a little bit later. And it's funny to me now because there's like some states that don't even recognize daylight saving now, right? Like Arizona is not even paying any attention to it, right? Like they do their own thing.
Yeah, they make jokes of all of the rest of us moving our clocks. But yeah, Arizona, they do not change their clocks. So for them, nothing would change for them. But if this does pass, as you mentioned, it would basically keep our daylight saving time year round, which means in the fall, we would just never fall back. We would just stick with that the rest of the year, which, and for us in Ohio, that means the sunrise wouldn't be until almost 9 a.m., which I'm not personally a huge fan of, because then you have kids standing out at bus stops when it is completely pitch black. And I think there's some safety issues with that if it does pass and we keep daylight saving year round.
Right. And there's, safety issues on the other side too, where people talk about increase in accidents when it's dark at night. So there's definitely like people on both sides of this. But, you're a morning meteorologist, so I would guess that most morning meteorologists who wake up in the dark anyway want it to get darker a little bit earlier in the evening. Because, what time do you go to bed?
I go to bed at 7 p.m. So
there you go. So you don't want it to be light until 9.
I look forward to when the sunset is early in December, January, February, because it's easier for me to get to bed at night. But I am kind of the oddball that goes to bed at 7 p.m.
Right.
But yeah, I think that for me, especially working in the mornings, I like to show, tower cams and the road conditions or the sky conditions on the cameras. However, if the sun's not coming up until 9 a.m. for months on end, then I'm just showing dark images.
Right. Okay. So there's that aspect of things. And then there's really sleep experts are all kind of on the same page too when it comes to, they prefer standard time. They say that for our health and for our circadian rhythm, it's actually healthier not only not to change the clocks twice a year, but to stay on that standard time and kind of work with the sun and operate our lives around when the sun's up and when the sun's down. That's kind of what we're getting into today with today's podcast, because I'm going to talk to an expert in circadian rhythms. His name is Dr. Chris Depner, and he's an assistant professor of health and kinesiology at the University of Utah. So he's done a lot of research on circadian rhythms and the effect that it has on our health. And there's really hard research about how even just 1 hour change can impact our health over a period of time. So even it doesn't feel like much. And I feel like we adjust quickly to that 1 hour, especially when you start thinking about if you're flying across time zones, how much that impacts you. But it's really interesting. He has a lot of really cool things to say about this. And I think that you'll be on board with what he has to say too, because he's a very strong supporter of sticking with that standard time year round.
It's interesting because I think people have such strong feelings one way or the other, because there's pros and cons to both of them. And I understand why we initially started daylight saving, just to give people that extra bit of time in the summertime, the warmer months, and basically for farmers too, to have that extra daylight in the evening to take care of stuff rather than having the sun come up so early.
One might argue just get up earlier though, just get out of bed. Yeah. Maybe we need to adjust our society to, the way that it should be with the sun. So it's interesting. It'll be interesting to listen to and to see what happens in the coming years. Andrew Buck Michael, where can we find your podcast if we want to listen to it?
So I'm on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Those are the two big ones, but really any of your favorite podcasting app, just look up Weathering the Run. And I've talked to some really interesting people, some people that have got world records in running, but it's always interesting because a lot of those runners will not bend. If the weather's nasty, they'll still get outside and go run through it. So not only just what they've had to run through, but also some of the gear and mindset that they have to get outside and run in the worst weather.
And I'm guessing they don't want to wait until 9 a.m. to run either. They want the sun coming up early.
Yeah, they'll run no matter what.
Yeah, that's true. Awesome. Andrew Buck Michael, thank you so much for being on. I appreciate your time today and your knowledge on the Sunshine Protection Act. Keep updating us on what's going on with this.
Will do. Thanks.
All right, Chris, thanks so much for being on. This is great to get your opinion as a sleep expert, somebody who can really tell us what's best for our bodies when it comes to time changes. And so I want to get a little bit of background on you and what your expertise is, because you run a lab, correct? What are you studying in your lab?
Yeah, so I'm at the University of Utah in the Department of Health and Kinesiology, and we run a sleep and circadian physiology lab, and we are mainly focused on how short sleep duration or circadian misalignment, which is commonly experienced by shift workers, how those types of things can increase people's risk for diabetes and obesity and heart disease. And sort of our ultimate hope is that if we can discover how this happens, we can develop countermeasures that prevent those adverse health risks from happening.
Okay, you made me think of something totally different there because I was a broadcast meteorologist for years and woke up at 2 a.m. every morning. So,
totally.
yikesies. Okay, fortunately, those days are behind me. But okay, so let's talk about what circadian rhythm even means. Can you give me a little backstory on this and where it comes from?
Totally. So the word circadian means about a day or about 24 hours. And so pretty much every living organism on planet Earth has a circadian rhythm or a 24-hour pattern to their physiology. And obviously, this is driven by the 24-hour rotation of Earth on its axis. So we have these 24-hour light-dark cycles, and that pretty much has imposed these rhythms in all living organisms. So even back in the 1700s, people noticed that plants sort of open up in the day and close up at night, and that's very reproducible with exposure to sun. And so sort of as those observations progressed, we realized that not only do plants have that, but pretty much all animals and even like bacteria have these 24-hour patterns that help us sort of not only adapt, but predict the rotation of the Earth. And so it helps our physiology sort of anticipate these cycles that are very predictable.
Okay, so what does light and dark have to do with it?
So in humans, our circadian system or our circadian clock is entrained primarily by light exposure specifically. And so we actually have cells in our eyes that directly connect. It's a direct neuronal connection from our eyes to our clock in our brain. And those cells are activated or controlled specifically by light exposure. So we know like when it's day, it's signaling directly to our clock in our brain that like it's light out and it's day. And same with when it's dark. And sort of, I guess, as we kind of progress in this, we'll think about like in modern society, now we have electrical lighting. And so our brain starts to get confused, like, is it day or night? Because we're turning on the lights when the sun's down. So
do we need less sleep in the summer when the days are longer?
That's a really interesting question. And there is some evidence that humans, sort of our circadian clock does adapt to winter and summer timeframes, especially sort of the further away you get from the equator where the difference is larger in summer and sort of winter daylight. And we did some studies back at the University of Colorado where we took people camping and we had them live without any electrical lighting. So their only light exposure was sunlight and campfire. And we did this at the summer solstice and the winter solstice. And we found that actually our circadian clocks under those conditions entrained to essentially the timing of sunrise and sunset. So our sort of biological night was a little bit longer during winter and it was a little bit shorter during summer because that's what the daylight hours are. And so how this, that was a difference of a couple of hours. And so how this actually relates to, maybe saying that you need less sleep in the summer, more in the winter, that would maybe be the next step of the study. But there is evidence that, there is some seasonal differences in humans between summer and winter.
Okay, so when you were talking about your lab and what you're studying and the impacts on health, so I'm curious how you know that sleep does impact health. Like, how do you make that direct correlation between, sleep and, say, diabetes?
Right. So there's a couple of big pieces of evidence. The first one is there's large longitudinal studies. So they followed people. Some of these have done it for up to 16 years. And so they track their sleep, typically using wrist actigraphy, which is just, you wear it on your wrist. It's, similar to like an Apple Watch or a Fitbit, and it can track your sleep. It's just a research device. So it's not actually giving information back to the participants. And so, the field has done this where we follow people for several years. And like I said, some studies have gone up to 16 years. And it shows that people who have shorter sleep durations compared to people who get 7 or more hours per night, over these longitudinal timeframes, the people who have short sleep duration tend to develop diabetes at higher rates than people who get adequate sleep. So that's one piece of evidence that, there might be this link between not getting enough sleep and risk of diabetes. And then we've done a lot of studies where we take perfectly healthy people, bring them into the lab and restrict their sleep for a week or 2 weeks down to like 4 hours per night. So this is really extreme sleep restriction, but we control everything in the lab. So we know that like really the only thing we're changing is their sleep. And when we do this and we measure their metabolism, some people go from perfectly healthy to levels that would almost be considered pre-diabetic in just a couple of days. We do know that after about 7 days of recovery sleep, they go back to their normal healthy baseline levels. But that does show that very quickly, if you're not getting enough sleep, it can have detrimental impacts on your physiology in a way that can increase your risk for diabetes.
So is recovery possible if you've been doing poor sleep for, say, years? Can you get back to being in good health and not get that pre-diabetic disposition?
Right. So that's really important because, we're really concerned with people who are chronically not getting enough sleep. And so we are now here at the University of Utah starting to do studies where we're recruiting people who have habitual short sleep duration and are at elevated risk for diabetes. So these are older people. They might have overweight or obesity and maybe some other existing risk factors. But we know they have short sleep duration and they've had that for at least a year and some people several years. And we're trying to then help them improve their sleep and ultimately get longer sleep duration over, some of our studies are 2 months and some of them are going all the way up to an entire year. And then we're doing kind of the same physiological measures after improving their sleep to see if we can reduce their risk for diabetes and heart disease. Those studies are ongoing and hopefully over the next 1 to 3 years, we'll have more data coming out on those. There's some evidence that, these type of sleep interventions are helping, but the reality is the really rigorous trials are still in progress. So we can't say for sure yet, but that's kind of the next step of the research.
Okay, so let's talk about daylight saving and how we are changing our clocks twice a year at this point. What does that do? An hour doesn't seem like much. Everybody says they feel it. Some people less so. But what is that actually doing to our health to change the clock twice a year?
So it's actually doing quite a lot to our circadian clock. And, there's definitely some pretty strong evidence at the anecdotal level. People notice it. And especially when you spring forward in the spring, so you lose that hour of sleep, nobody likes that. And everybody complains about it. It's anecdotally, you can feel that you're missing that hour of sleep. And so, at that level, that is an indication that it does have some physiological consequences. And then when we look at sort of the population level, we know that during that spring forward timeframe, during that week when that happens, after that time change on the highways, there's more accidents and there's more severe accidents that result in people dying. There's a higher incidence of heart attacks. And so we know that, there's data like this that shows that just losing that 1 hour of sleep, it's associated with these really severe adverse health outcomes. And then on the flip side of it, we don't see that happen in the fall when we fall back and you get an extra hour of sleep. So there isn't an increase in accidents. There isn't these elevated risk of heart attacks during that week. And so that's really nice data that directionally shows that losing that hour of sleep is important. And then if you think about it from maybe a time zone point of view, even if you just shift one time zone, there's a little bit of jet lag that happens. And essentially that's what we're imposing on everybody when we make you shift your clocks forwards or backwards. We're okay, all of a sudden you have to change time zones. And although it is only 1 hour, there are these physiological consequences. And then, obviously we're sort of, by having daylight savings time, we're artificially imposing this on everybody twice a year and saying, okay, you have to shift around. And so we think that's probably not helping anybody sort of achieve optimal health.
Okay, so there is a group of people, a lot of people, who would love to just shift to daylight saving time all year long. What is your opinion on that?
So I'm definitely of the opposite opinion, where probably the optimal would be, if we're going to adopt one time, it's going to be standard time, which is right now what is what we are on during winter time. And so I will say there's a couple of, there's surveys out there, and a lot of the surveys have been worded in a way that would support sort of daylight savings time, which is summertime. And the surveys have been worded do you like summertime or wintertime better? And so not surprisingly, a lot of people say, I like summertime better. But that doesn't actually mean that that's, the daylight savings time is what people are going to prefer. And so the issue with daylight savings time is that shifts our clock in a way where the sun's going to rise later in the day and we're going to get extra light in the evening though. So the sun sets later, and that's really nice in the summer. People like to barbecue, you go to the park, and that extra light in the evening, people do enjoy that. And is what is sort of lost on it, though, is what that means is if we adopted that permanently year round, that means in the wintertime when the sun is already kept rising later, that means it's even going to be later now. It's going to be 1 hour later. And so a lot of places people aren't realizing like sunrise would maybe not be between 9 or 10 a.m. in the winter months. And that could have very severe consequences. You know, people like children are going to be going to school in the dark now. People are going to be commuting to work in the dark. And you're going to typically feel more sleepy because the sun hasn't come up yet. And you will have that extra light in the evening. But the reality is, from like a public safety point of view, that darkness in the winter months is going to be really it has potential major public health concerns.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said, because I hear so many people say, that would be great if it stayed light later. But that's just one tiny part of the puzzle, I guess. There's a lot of other pieces, and maybe nobody knows what's best for their health, too.
Right. And it's all, if we think about like the circadian physiology, we know that getting more light in the early morning hours, like right after you wake up, sort of helps align your circadian clock to the normal cycle that's going on. And so if we adopted permanent daylight savings time, we're going to be shifting that an hour later for everybody. So you're going to be less light in the morning. And so we know, again, not only is there like public safety concerns, but from a physiological point of view, like that could increase risk of psychological disorders. Like there's a lot of people, especially even if you just experience like seasonal affective disorder, one of the effective treatments is to get more light in the morning. And so we're just going to be minimizing that for everyone across the board if we adopt permanent daylight savings time.
Interesting. I didn't know that about morning light. Okay, so do you have any tips as we are changing the clocks? Because nothing drastic is happening yet. We're kind of as is right now with changing the clocks coming up. So any tips as we go into this spring forward and we lose that hour to prepare or to adjust to coming out of it?
Yes. So the best way, so we are springing forward, so we're going to lose that hour of sleep. And so probably the best way to approach this is to, instead of do it all on that one night when when the time changes, gradually do this over at least a week. And so that's going to be much easier, and your physiology is going to adapt to that much quicker if you do it over several nights instead of this very drastic one night. And so you could just simply start going to bed about 15 minutes earlier for a couple of nights in a row. And on the same side, wake up about 15 minutes earlier so that you've sort of already adjusted your circadian clock to this new time before it actually happens. And so it's going to be easier to do it over like 15-minute increments, 10 or 15-minute increments over several nights instead of an hour in one night. And then sort of along with that, if you do start to get up a little bit earlier, try to get bright light first thing when you wake up. And for many people, that still might be before the sun rises. So turn the lights on in your house as bright as possible. So get as much light exposure as you can in those sort of 30 to 60 minutes after you wake up. And then in the evening, do the exact opposite. When you're getting ready to go to bed, especially if you're trying to go to bed 10 to 15 minutes early, really dim the lights in your house as much as possible. Don't use overhead lights. Try to use like lamps that might disperse the light more at sort of the ground level, so it's not coming into your eyes as much. And so reducing that light exposure at nighttime before bed will also help you adapt to that quicker.
We hear a lot about blue light. What is the deal with different types of light? And does that matter?
It does matter. And so in general, the cells in our eyes that directly signal to our circadian clock, those are most impacted by blue light. And, that's actually very close to like the spectrum of the sun. And so it's not surprising that it is blue light. Sort of the unfortunate aspect to that, we're most sensitive to blue light, but also LED screens, which is computer screens, your phone screens, tablet screens, those are all LEDs. Those tend to peak in the blue spectrum. So they do give you a lot of blue light. And so to try and avoid sort of the negative impacts of looking at your phone at night or looking at other screens from that blue light, it's really blue enriched. You can use filters on those screens. So I know the iPhone has like the night shift mode. There's other types of filters that make your screen look kind of orange at night. I know it looks a little bit funny, but honestly, those do work really well and they shift the spectrum. So it does reduce the blue light. And so that can minimize the negative effects of getting that light exposure at night. And again, it can kind of, if you use those effectively, it can help you sort of adapt your circadian clock to this time change. So those are effective ways.
So blue light glasses do actually work, because I've heard people say both ends. Like I've heard some people say, well, those are BS. Those you're still waste your money. But it's true. They work.
If they're effective blue light glasses, they do work. So
the cheap ones I got on Amazon.
Right. There's some problems. Like there actually is a publication and they tested like 50 different blue light glasses. And some of them do work really well at blocking blue light. And some of them that you may have gotten on Amazon for, say, $10 are pretty much useless. And they're just like clear pieces of glass that light's totally coming through. And so in general, I know it's a little bit counterintuitive, but like the ones that have orange lenses, I know they're not the most fashionable.
Ugly ones,
yeah, those are, of course, the ones that are going to work the best. So if you do get some effective ones, use those at nighttime. I'd say like 2 to even 3 hours before bedtime. Those can really help mitigate light exposure at night, especially after the sun has set. So they can work, but the cheap ones don't.
Okay, got it. Okay, what about eating? I know you've done some research on eating. Is there a time of day when we should eat? I've heard eat when the sun's up. Is that true?
Honestly, that's like the easiest way to think about going about it. So eat when the sun's up. That's typically going to be during your biological day. And that's when your body is prepared to metabolize and digest food. And so you're going to metabolize it much more efficiently. Whereas at nighttime, after the sun has set, your body's starting to transition to the biological night. And sort of your clock is tuning our physiology to not consuming food. So fasting overnight and not being physically active and getting ready to sleep. And so eating food during that time, not only does your body not metabolize it or process it as well, if you're still digesting food when you're trying to sleep, that can cause things like heartburn and that can disrupt your sleep. And if it's really bad, you can wake up many times throughout the night with really bad heartburn, and that's very disruptive to your sleep. And not only is it going to cause heartburn, you're not metabolizing it as well. So I think that actually is, like, as a general rule of thumb, trying to eat when the sun's up is a really good target. And if you can follow that, that's going to be helpful advice.
One last question that I just jotted down as you were talking earlier, which you may think I'm crazy. So as we're starting to think about space travel and going to Mars, I was watching The Martian the other night, and if people go to Mars, the circadian rhythm is going to be different, right? Because the hours are different. It's like a different amount of hours in a sol. So what's the deal there? Are we going to be able to adapt if we go to Mars, or are we going to be just constantly tired? And by we, I mean people much smarter than me.
Yeah. So there is, there's, when NASA was developing the space station, they actually consulted a lot of circadian scientists to design the lighting on the International Space Station to optimize this for our circadian clocks. And so not only is it like the timing of light exposure, but considering like, is it blue light and what's the color of the light and how can we make sure that we're, helping astronauts minimize the potential adverse consequences that could be happening from, this random light exposure in theory in space. And so, Mars, there is a study on this and it's semi-embarrassing. I don't remember. I believe it might
there's a study
be close enough. So there is. So NASA's been interested in this. The idea of going to Mars has been like
they're one step ahead,
a real
all the
thing.
time.
Yeah. So, they've definitely started to look into this. If I remember correctly, Mars might be close enough to Earth that as far as the rotation, that we might be able to adapt to that.
It's not that far off. It's 40 minutes longer.
Right.
I didn't realize
so
that.
We
okay,
can.
I thought it
That's
was
what
like
I
27
thought.
hours.
No. So yeah, it's close enough that I think we might actually be able to live just fine on Mars from a circadian perspective. I don't know about the intensity of light, like during the daytime. And, we might have to think about that. And as far as like, not burning our eyes because the light's too intense. So in theory, I think we could adapt to living on Mars from a circadian perspective. But that is a very important thing, even like, the journey to Mars, so during that time, what is light exposure like in that travel and how do we regulate that to help the astronauts, maintain their circadian rhythm? So it's actually a really critically important aspect of space travel is making sure that, we are allowing for optimal circadian regulation of the astronauts, whether it's Mars, the space station, or en route to Mars, et cetera. So
in that same sort of respect, but bringing it back to Earth, what about these, like, latitude-wise, once you get higher up, like places that are close to the North or the South Pole, are poor health, is that a bigger issue in those areas?
We are really concerned that there's higher rates, especially of like psychological disorders in those areas, and like rates of depression. And there's a lot of concern that part of what's driving that is the lack of light, especially in the winter months. And we know that that's beyond sort of, as you get far enough north, that's beyond the limits of entrainment of the human circadian system. And so really the only way you can adapt to that would be using electrical lighting. And, that while that's possible, it's really challenging. It's kind of the same as thinking about it for shift workers. Like, if you can adapt to shift work, if you get zero sunlight during the day when the sun's out and you get, all electrical lighting at nighttime, you can adapt to that, but it's really hard because society still functions during the day, and most people have families or other functions they still go outside when the sun's up. So it's really, really challenging to do that. And the same, it is really challenging to adopt to living at those extreme locations. Reindeer live in those types of locations. And so there's a lot of interesting work on how reindeer's circadian clocks adapt to the summer months versus the winter months. And there's like some evidence that maybe during the winter months, the reindeer circadian clock, it still functions, but it doesn't seem to control their physiology as strongly during the winter months when they're in complete darkness. Again, there might be utility in understanding how other animals can live in those types of locations and see if we can implement that in humans at all.
Wow. Very cool stuff. Chris, is there anything else you want to add about time changes, circadian rhythms?
I would just say, like, overall with the time change, like in general, if we can adopt, at least like stop switching the clock around. So whether it's permanent standard time or permanent daylight savings time, we do think that avoiding the time change twice a year would be beneficial. Pretty much everybody is on board with that. And, I think the data is strong from a scientific perspective that standard time is the way to go. And I'll just say that in the 70s, for 2 years, we tried as a country to go to permanent daylight savings time. There was a bill, it passed. We actually did it. And everybody, the first winter that came around, it was dark until like 9 or 10 in the morning, like I'm saying. And everybody disliked that so much that they actually it didn't even last for 2 years. They canceled it. So we've actually already tried this and we know it doesn't work. So let's not do it again.
Off the Radar is a production of the National Weather Desk. Make sure you're following the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes publish every Tuesday. If you know someone that has a strong opinion on the time change, please share this episode with them. We'd also love you to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Let us know what you think of the show and give me some ideas for future episodes. Special thanks to Dr. Christopher Depner from the University of Utah and to Andrew Buck Michael from ABC6 in Columbus, Ohio for joining me today. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie. Make it a great day.